absolutely pathetic contribution to this debate, and that proves that Nationals started working on this policy based on some of the analysis provided by IRD in April. April at best is when Nationals decided that perhaps public pressure had finally come to bear on them and it was time that they started having a little look over on this side at the policies that would benefit families. And Mr. Speaker, budgets should be about people. That's absolutely what budgets should be about. They should be focused on, if we are indeed moving to surplus, how can we ensure that hard-working New Zealanders are enjoying the spoils of any prosperity we're supposedly moving into. And our disappointment on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, is that New Zealanders, by and large, are not benefiting from any recovery. They're not. And even this budget is a fudget budget, an attempt to make it feel like some families are going to get some small scraps from this budget. They could have done so much more. They could have done so much more. And Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to point out where there are elements of this budget that would have been a vast improvement, particularly for families and particularly for newborn children. In particular, when it comes to a little bit of the papering over that has happened, it's especially happened for our most vulnerable children. 285,000 children living in poverty in New Zealand. Out of this budget, they've got a bit of a clear Duracell cover over the top of that issue, because what we needed was step change. What we needed, and what has been called for some time, was an action plan that was focused on the well-being of all children, of which paid parental leave and changes to tax credit should have been one part around income that should be focused on lifting the well-being of all of those children. As Plunkett said, and I quote, "Poverty continues to hamper progress for all children. Plunkett would like to see a coordinated plan to genuinely tackle child poverty using measurable child poverty targets." That's what they said in respect to the budget. And from UNICEF New Zealand encourages the government and all political parties to commit to a comprehensive plan to address child poverty with targets, measurement and clear accountability. That, Mr. Speaker, is exactly what this Labour Party will do in government. We already have a bill that sets out exactly how we would do it. And we would do it with more than just our Best Start policy, because we recognise that our Best Start policy is just one part of a much wider plan that's required. But let's do a little bit of policy comparison. If indeed it's been talked about as Best Start Light, let's see where in particular, unfortunately, the government's plans have not addressed some really key areas. It's done a little, but it's still no cigar. So let's look at paid parental leave. Currently, we've got 14 weeks of paid parental leave. The government has proposed extending that to 18 weeks. Good to see an extension. Labour's policy has always, however, been 26 weeks since we've been in this. We have been pushing hard for 26 weeks. Sue Moroney has done an enormous amount of work in conjunction with 26 for Babies to try and get that government to move an inch on paid parental leave. It is disappointing that we haven't seen them go all the way to 26 weeks, because 26 weeks is what evidence and research says we should be doing. In fact, Labour has said that we ideally would like to be at a year, but we recognise that would take time, and so 26 weeks is our policy, and unfortunately 18 weeks just does not cut it when it comes to what the research clearly tells us benefits children. In fact, growing up in New Zealand, fantastic piece of research currently underway. The biggest update on longitudinal studies since the Dunedin study has showed us that parents currently try and bring together every bit of leave they're entitled to, scrimping to try and get that little extra bit of time. 26 weeks would make a massive difference, and we want to pay tribute to the work Sue Moroney has done to eke out 4 weeks out of that government. So that's part of our Best Start payment. What about the parental tax credit? Now, we should first acknowledge the origins of the parental tax credit. Jenny Shipley came up with it in the 1990s when she recognised that there were a large chunk of parents, 60%, who aren't eligible for paid parental leave. And actually, the small tweaks the government has made, whilst laudable, actually won't make a big dent in that eligibility. So we've got 60% of parents who weren't getting anything. So she stepped in and said, I'm going to create this little tax credit, which will still go to a narrow group. Not every parent who doesn't get paid parental leave gets a parental tax credit. And it does abate. Let's be very clear on that. So she introduced that at a rate of $150 a week for 8 weeks. Now, the change the government has made in these proposals is to extend the rate, increase the rate to $220 and increase the length to 10 weeks. Now, how does that, for the group of parents who are eligible, they've changed the eligibility, they've reduced it. They've reduced it now so that it's more in line with families who might be eligible for the family tax credit or in-work tax credit. So basically, if a family out there doesn't get that, you won't get the parental tax credit. That's the message now. Let's compare that to the Best Start payment. Best Start said, look, the parental tax credit, it's kind of fudging things. It's not covering everyone who isn't getting paid parental leave. It's not near universal. Why don't we just scrap it and start again? And that's what Best Start did. Best Start says, actually, for parents who don't get paid parental leave and who earn under $150,000, we want all of you to receive some support when your baby first arrives. 95% of parents receive the Best Start payment, and they receive it at a rate of $60 a week. For families who don't get PPL, they get it for 12 months. For families who do get PPL, paid parental leave, it kicks in after their paid parental leave ends. Mr. Speaker, on every count, the Best Start payment helps more families, it helps them for longer, and it's more generous. And here's the kicker. Here's the thing that makes the biggest difference between Best Start and what the government's proposed. The government's proposals exclude our most vulnerable, low-income families. They get absolutely nothing from that package that the government has introduced. The roughly 14,000 parents who we know are living below the poverty line are still excluded from this government's plans. Best Start left none of those children behind. In fact, it said to those children, we'll support those kids until they're 3. Not just their first year, but for 3 years. So the 50,000 children living in poverty would benefit from the Best Start package for 3 years. That is a big difference between what Labor proposed and what this government is proposing. And that is what distinguishes what Labor is about and what National is about. We wanted to lift the well-being of all children, but with a special focus on the most vulnerable. That government has said, we want to do a little bit of a lift for some. And for us, it was about extending on both ends, where this government has narrowed the parental tax credit and left actually some of those income earners who very rarely get anything. Those were the ones who have also been cut out today, as well as those at the end. Yes, John Armstrong, I think, said it best when he said, this is the great brain robbery, the Labor Party brain that is. He says, if ever an explanation was needed as to why opposition parties like to say mum on their policies for as long as possible, then look no further than this budget. Absolutely. But you know what? We stand by announcing our policy in January because we know what we announced set out a clear difference that this government still has not been able to keep pace with. They still reverted to type in the people who they've decided to lift. They still could have done so much better. And we will continue to promote helping the most vulnerable families with no shame on this side of the House and make sure that we promote policies that are for the many, not for the few, but ultimately are focused on children, not blame, not reverting to type, on stereotypes around who should get assistance and who shouldn't. Instead, just saying, if we lift children, we lift everyone. And that is what Labor policy is about. That is what a Labor budget would have been about. And that is how we will hold this government to account.
Very good speech.
I call Jan Logie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's with pleasure I rise to take a call in this urgent debate on this bill, which the name of which is beyond me right at the